You focus on 4 different sites in particular in America as a way to explore, colonialism, uh, oppression, power, and particularly, uh, white colonial relationships with, indigenous people in the United States, this cycle of power and ruin. Can you explain the genesis of this idea and why you chose to focus on these stories as a part of your whole, thesis, I guess?
Yeah, so it actually came out of my first book, which is about a topic that on its surface I think seems very different. It's about parapsychology and its origins in 19th century psychical research. Um, and so as I was working on that book, which is a lot of it is about sort of how regular people were experimenting with like powers of mind, clairvoyance, telepathy, and things like that. And I encountered this one case where an individual had a psychic experience where they believed that they had seen into the past, into the ancient North American past. Um, and they had this experience while they were touring a mound, an indigenous burial mound in Miamisville, Ohio. And that was it seemed like such a strange scenario that I had to learn more about it. And that sort of spiritual connection with the North American past, both evident in the person's vision and in the fact of like mound tourism as kind of a routine aspect of like travel in the 19th century. That made me look at sites and look at like tourism and the ways that people moved across the land and sort of consumed the landscape in certain ways. And so that was kind of like a weird entry point into this project. But yeah, like one aspect of it was like tourism practices and like the desire for like spiritual connection that often turns into consumption. And then that sort of leads to like an association with resources and resource extraction.
Well, can I one, I mean, that brings up a lot of different, branches of kind of new age, spirituality, but 2, can I ask if this person who had this what their race was?
Oh yeah, so this was a white person, and
Right.
so this was like settler tourism of what was then the West, the Ohio River Valley.
Right, and so that very much is in keeping with a lot of your writing here, the exploration of, uh, mysticism as a theme from white settlers using mysticism to justify their extraction or at least make, allow their minds to be okay with what they were doing, and then also just the more organic mysticism, of these sites from the natural perspective as well.
Yeah, yeah, and it's something that have obviously thought a lot about. Like that there certainly are many ways of understanding the world and encountering spaces and history. But like I think the key thing is like understanding and being curious about the history of these practices themselves and the functions that they've played, and that this desire for connection, understanding, meaning can kind of serve political purposes.
So can we start with, the myth of the mound builders as one of the first, stories that you tell in your book?
Yeah, yeah. And so the vision that I mentioned at the beginning of this tourist in Miamisville is actually an exception to the norm. That person had a psychic vision that actually disproved the mound builder myth. And so that's why I especially found it fascinating. So they were espousing like what we would now consider to be like a correct historical view that indigenous native North American people built the mounds. However, there was a very popular argument throughout the 19th century that these earthworks, which included both sort of conical burial mounds, effigy mounds that were shaped like figures or animals, um, and ceremonial mounds like the one at Cahokia. Um, that throughout the 19th century, there were purveyors of these alternate histories, that those sites had been constructed by a quote unquote lost race, potentially of European descent, although not always. And there were so many different sort of proliferating alternative histories that it almost doesn't matter the specific one. It's more about casting into doubt any association with indigenous history and claims to the land.
So, do you mind expanding a bit more on that story? How I guess it came to be, how it persisted, and really, how it does fit into larger themes that we still see in American thought today, like manifest destiny and other ways that um, white Americans perceive their role on this continent.
Yeah, so I mean, you could read it sort of as the antiquarian expression of manifest destiny, I suppose. That um, and there's a phrase that an archaeologist whose name I am not going to remember or pronounce correctly, but it's not my phrase. But this idea of the colonization of the past, um, that in tandem with sort of westward expansion and indigenous dispossession, there was work to be done in the sciences by antiquarians, at first antiquarians, and then sort of more professional archaeologists, um, to tell a story about the history of the continent that supported and justified what was being done in contemporary politics. Um, and so, of course, there were always conflicts over, there were always people who opposed that narrative and who argued for the indigenous origins of these monuments and earthworks. And so it's not that it was a done deal, but the narrative of the lost race was very popular, and I think because it served these sort of emotional purposes.
I just have to jump in. I'm from Mandan, North Dakota, and the Mandan Indians had. There's a similar myth that a Welsh prince in like the 17th century went off with a bunch of his sort of like servants and stuff, and somehow crossed the Atlantic and went up the Mississippi and then founded the Mandan Indian tribe. And it's just like it's really Thomas Jefferson believed that when he bought Louisiana, and it's just yeah, like the need to believe that oh, Europeans are there amongst this, like it gives some sort of claim or something. So there is a need for that sort of myth.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to point out that it is associated with claiming, because like on its face, I think, and there's this world of sort of what some archaeologists call like fantastic archaeology or pseudo archaeology that tells of these, incredible journeys in antiquity, transcontinental or transoceanic journeys. And it's like we know that Vikings did reach North America, and so we can't like deny the possibility of any such things. At the same time, it's like there's no evidence for that. The Welsh story is definitely, it's definitely a fantastical claim, but yeah, like what is the political and affective function of it?
It's to, promote white supremacy in colonial ambitions. I mean, that's a broad way of characterizing it, I would say. But that's a great. I mean, I didn't know that example, Matt. I'm sure there are countless others, but you also zero in on Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, who married an indigenous woman, and then uh, basically perpetuated a lot of tropes through his writing, but was perceived as the foremost authority on Native American culture for a little while, or perhaps that's too broad, but he was able to capitalize on his characterizations of Native American culture as a white man. What did you find in researching his work and his life? and his place in America at that time.
Yeah, so I found Schoolcraft very interesting, not in sort of his like having achieved great power, but in his kind of representativeness of this kind of like middling person who's like a functionary of empire, and who sees the value uh, of taking indigenous knowledge and shaping it in particular ways so that it is serviceable to this project of U.S. empire. And so he is sort of self-educated through sort of a series of previous business failures, gets appointed to the position of Indian agent for the Office of Indian Affairs, also known as the Indian Bureau at that time. And so he's sent to the Michigan Territory, and like a lot of settlers who were there previously as part of the fur trade, he marries into an Ojibwe family who are kind of like very prominent political leaders in the region. And so he is accepted into this family and is, you know, clearly like loves his wife and children, and yet he's part of this project, and not only sort of governing this territory that has been effectively conquered, but he gets very interested in collecting Ojibwe traditions and stories and publishes those under his name as sort of material, not just for the like governing of Indigenous people, but again, for white Americans to feel this kind of affective connection with place and a sense of like that they're inheriting these sort of characteristics of the country.
Right. So that you mentioned this concept of ownership too, and it seems like he plays a role in scholarship or in writing, where people, white colonists, white people can feel a connection or ownership over the land, and the mysticism associated with it, and thus native culture. But these myths are not just there for rhetorical purposes or as bedtime stories. They're there for ownership that leads to mass commodification of land, and also of um, yeah, of everything that flows from that. So, do you mind just talking a bit about that? Because then we can, I think, transition into how the early oil barons begin to utilize this.
Yeah, and so that's definitely the thread of the book. These 4 sections are like each about different resources, which is a very ambitious thing to do. And I'm not an environmental historian, so it's kind of, I think for a trained environmental historian, it might be insane to try to do that. But for me, I was following that thread of affective claims and these feelings of ownership and specific resources, and the land is sort of the primary resource. And you know, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz writes this in her Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, that like land is the first source of wealth and power for the U.S.